Alrighty, well, it is 12 o'clock, so we will get started. Hello, everybody. I am Narelle Kipple, the Membership and Programs Coordinator for the American Solar Energy Society. And I'd like to thank you for joining us on our monthly webinar series. Before we get started, I wanted to update you on who ASES is and highlight some of our current events and programs. The American Solar Energy Society, also known as ASES, is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that was established in 1954 and advocates for sustainable living and 100% renewable energy by sharing information, events, and resources to cultivate community and power progress. You can join our community at any time at ases.org/join. As webinar registrants, you get a special 10% discount on all ASES memberships, excluding our life memberships, by using the promo code webinar. ASES will be having our 51st annual National Solar Conference, Solar 2022, Energy Transition with Economic Justice in Albuquerque, New Mexico at the University of New Mexico from June 21st to 24th in 2022. And we are now accepting proposals to present at the conference. So please submit a call for participation by November 15th. And you can learn more about the ASES conference at ases.org/conference. The 2021 National Solar Tour just happened earlier this month on October 2nd and 3rd, but all virtual local solar tours and solar sites will stay live until January 15th of 2022. You can watch and learn why people in your community made the choice to go solar, and also mark your calendars for the 2022 National Solar Tour on October 1st and 2nd, 2022. To get involved and learn more, go to nationalsolartour.org. ASES also invites you to participate in our online community. This is a space for our community to collaborate, share content and information, and network with each other. ASES just launched a new online forum, the Ask a Renewable Energy Expert, where we have our technical division experts on call to help answer your questions about anything solar and sustainable related. Be sure to hop online now and start engaging with your peers at community.ases.org. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the ASES updates. I want to note that this webinar will be available in a recorded format soon. ASES will follow up with everybody once it is available. Please be sure to submit any comments to the chat section and questions to the question and answer section. We will cover all the questions at the end of the presentation. Your presenter today will be Josh Hansen. Josh started his stormwater compliance career in the Mid-Atlantic region, where state and local regulations were very strict and enforcement activity was relatively high. He has worked with national and regional home builders, land development companies, power generation, and transmission companies, and renewable energy companies to help them meet their compliance needs. Since relocating to the Midwest, he has a unique perspective on where state and local regulations could be heading in the near future. Josh has participated in technical advisory committees and stakeholder meetings for several state construction general permit renewals. He has also developed state-specific stormwater pollution prevention plan templates in several states and aided in the development of client-specific templates. He has conducted and overseen thousands of compliance inspections and audits and developed client-specific stormwater compliance audit reports and programs. He has developed trainings for the development of stormwater pollution prevention plans and erosion and sediment control plans, as well as trainings for compliance inspections and compliant audits. He has also led the development of SWPPP inspection applications, the latest of which acts as a digital SWPPP complete with an integrated real-time updating SWPPP working map. At Olsson, he is the corporate technical resource for stormwater compliance, covering their entire company footprint. He is tasked with ensuring stormwater compliance related work products of the highest quality so that the client's risk is minimized while providing them with key information to meet their compliance goals. And now I will hand the webinar over to our speaker today, Josh Hansen with Olsson, presenting on SWPPP and new EPA rules. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, are we good? Can you see the presentation? All right, just a quick agenda. We're going to cover a lot of information today, so please hold your questions till the end and we'll get those. Basically, we're going to do a quick overview of NPDES program, which is Stormwater Clean Water Act compliance, and some proposed permit changes from EPA. We'll go over some stormwater compliance tips, consequences of non-compliance, avoiding some common pitfalls, and some common best management practices. Here we go. So the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, is Section 402 of the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act was established in 1972. A couple of rivers caught on fire, and that kind of drove this regulation to regulate point source pollutants. NPDES covers a lot of different program areas, and today we're going to focus on the stormwater program area. And inside that program area, we're going to focus on construction stormwater. The NPDES program is administered by EPA. It is an EPA program, but they delegate that responsibility to most states. So the states administer that program for their specific state, and they can then delegate down to the local level. So for example, if you have a project in a city limit, the city could inspect it, the state could inspect it, and then EPA could inspect on top of that. So there are several different layers of regulation to these regulations. Real quick, there are a lot of proposed changes to the EPA construction general permit, and that's kind of how the EPA sets their regulations for this. The EPA creates construction general permits, and the states also create their own construction general permits. The EPA is in the process of renewing their construction general permit. The current one expires February 16th of 2022. There was a 60-day comment period that ended July 12th. And I haven't seen many updates since then, so we'll kind of go over what I saw in July. So just like the states, EPA issues a general permit on a 5-year cycle. Some states model their permit requirements after some of the EPA requirements, but some states are a little more strict, and some states aren't very well defined or structured in their state permits. The states don't necessarily have to mimic the EPA guidelines, but they can't be less strict. So starting off, the first one, there's a proposed change to the definition of an operator. They're proposing including in that definition any entities that determine the acceptance of work and payment of work performed. And the way this can affect you and has trickled down into the state level is states like Colorado require the owner and the operator to obtain the NOI or the permit for construction. Oklahoma, they're in the process of renewing their permit next year. Some of the stakeholder meetings, they were thinking of requiring all operators on site to obtain a permit. So one project could have several, half a dozen permits. So that could affect project timelines, or people having to get permits and slips for multiple parts of the project. They're adding a dewatering discharge from contaminated sites to the prohibited discharge section, which is a little new, and it's not really clearly defined what constitutes contaminated. If it's prohibited discharge, it doesn't mean that you can't still get a permit. It just means you'll most likely have to provide very specific BMPs to treat those pollutants, or probably worst case scenario, you may have to get an individual permit, which is more strict than a general permit. They're thinking about increasing the review period of NOIs for Fish and Wildlife Service and marine fisheries reviews from 14 days, what it is now, to 30. So that's a pretty significant change. And again, these are for federally administered areas. There's 3 states that the EPA administers this, so this won't necessarily trickle down to the state level because the states pretty much have their reviews standardized anyway. They're better define the difference between maintenance and corrective actions, which if you've done any projects in Colorado or Oklahoma, those definitions are already there. There's a difference between a corrective action and a maintenance item that you see on your site. They're expanding the definition of kind of what those triggering events are, which is a good thing because right now it's a little confusing. They're tweaking some stabilization deadlines. They did have these stabilization deadlines in the past permit, but they've tweaked them a little bit. So I could see these trickling down to the state level, and they can be a little problematic. So let's just get into that real quick. For areas that disturb greater than 5 acres, they're toying with the 7-day stabilization requirement. In areas that are less than that, they're toying with the 14-day, which is kind of the current standard for most states. But then they're also added a requirement for a limit on 10 acres disturbed at any time, which some states have recommended these in the permits, but it's never been a requirement. So I'm not sure that this will make it through to the final version. And even if it does, there's probably gonna be some sort of litigation like usual. But this would be problematic if you're doing large projects, several 100-acre projects. Limiting your disturbed acreage to 10 doesn't really make sense. They're tweaking the guidance for storage of construction materials in a good way. In the past, they've had kind of broad requirements that you have to minimize the contact with stormwater for construction materials. But I mean, if you kind of think that through, some components are meant to be exposed to rain and stormwater for the duration of their service life. So they're kind of coming back on those, and hopefully that'll trickle down to the state level as well. Potential requirements for monitoring of dewatering discharges to sensitive areas, and this one's a little problematic. They always try and sneak in some sort of numeric effluent limitation guideline. They almost never kind of make it through to the final product, but this one could be problematic if you're discharging water to sensitive areas, as they've kind of set a benchmark that's pretty low, 50 NTUs, which isn't a lot. So we'll keep an eye on that one. They're including a requirement for site inspectors and members of the stormwater team to be certified by the EPA or a third party. And this is pretty significant because most states don't have a requirement for a certification. Some states do, but most just require the person be a qualified individual. If this kind of makes it through, then it'll be a little interesting because a lot of people have to get certified. The EPA is apparently developing a training and certification program, which is a little weird because there's a ton of third-party training companies out there that you can get certified through. Again, I'm assuming this won't make it through. I'm assuming it'll get taken out, but just wanted to make everybody aware of that. And then the last one, they're possibly requiring photo documentation for NOT submittal. There are a few states that already require this, like Missouri, for example. You have to submit a photo log with your NOT to kind of prove that your areas are stabilized. So this could be just a little change in NOT protocols. Compliance. Now we've kind of gone over the proposed changes to the EPA general permit. Now I kind of want to dig into compliance, stormwater compliance, and some helpful tips that you can use to meet your compliance goals. Probably the biggest thing to minimize your risk is compliance prior to construction, making sure all your documentation is in order, your permitting is sufficient, and your SWPPP is developed correctly. So again, kind of the erosion sediment control is kind of that first step in your pre-construction compliance. You want to make sure your erosion sediment control plan designer is using common sense structural BMPs. If you just see the site wrapped in silt fence and you got 500 acres drained at one point, that's probably not a good idea. You want to make sure they're controlling runoff, diverting water, using basins if applicable, using materials that are available on site. So if you have a lot of fill and you can use earthen structures instead of silt fence, that could be helpful depending on the topography, or if you had to clear some trees, you can use that mulch. That would also be preferable to some other BMPs. Do the specifications and details meet state requirements? This is something I've seen in a few projects that I've done compliance inspections for. If you're working with a large multi-state consultant, they may use a kind of a general specification or detail in their plans, but some states may require more stringent information be included, like a maintenance plan or schedule. There may be very specific design details that they want you to use. So just making sure that those are compliant with the state requirement, or the state or local requirements is pretty important. You know, do the plans themselves meet state or local requirements? You know, some states require flow lines be included on the plans, or certain contour intervals. Calling out specific features like wetlands or sensitive areas. You know, are the vegetated buffers being called out? Are the plans developed for all disturbed areas? Like, are there lay down yards that weren't accounted for? Things like that can kind of trip you up in terms of compliance if they aren't accounted for beforehand. SWPPP development. I've kind of run the gamut on SWPPP templates. I've seen some really good ones and some not so great ones. So it's good to kind of know what's in your SWPPP and not just sign off on it because your consultant always does it. You know, a couple things like non-structural BMPs are usually kind of a hot ticket item for compliance because they can sneak some kind of weird stuff in there that maybe you don't necessarily do on projects. Make sure there are multiple levels of quality control being conducted on these. Make sure your consultants has a very robust quality control program, and then make sure you're checking that on your side as well. I mean, especially those pollution prevention requirements or the housekeeping requirements. You know, I've seen SWPPPs that require your portable toilets be cleaned out every day, which of course that's never going to happen. Or they require any equipment being parked on a project have drip pans placed on them if they're parked overnight, which isn't always feasible or practicable. Double checking the strength of your SWPPP language is very important. If you see a lot of shalls and wills, those kind of paint you into a corner. If you shall do something or you will do something, you basically have to do that. Where if they're using softer language like should or may, it gives you a little wiggle room in those BMPs. Does the sequence of construction make sense? You know, I've seen some very interesting sequences of construction used in SWPPPs that don't necessarily apply to real world. So just kind of make sure you're double checking that stuff and it's compatible to what you're actually doing on site. And always remember, you know, if the SWPPP is more stringent than the local or state requirements, you have to abide by that SWPPP. So if you notice that from your consultant, or if you're developing these internally, just make sure that you're not overdoing it, I guess would be the best way to say it. If you want to meet those state requirements, you don't necessarily want to be more strict than that, especially if you can't achieve those goals, because then you'll be out of compliance. SWPPs are a difficult document. The best way to create a SWPP is to make it user-friendly for a contractor or subcontractor or anyone on site to be able to find the information they may need. A lot of times, SWPPs get put up on the shelf and thrown away at the end of the project and not touched in between. So you just need to make sure that they're user-friendly enough and organized in a way that people can actually use them. And remember, in most states, the permittee has to sign these, sign a certification stating that they will abide by the SWPP, and they know and understand what's in these SWPPs. Permitting strategies is not something people usually think about. They're very important on linear projects, but also in large areas of disturbance. If you can break those up into multiple permits, and maybe if you have it phased in such a way that the southern section will be done before the northern section, you can close out that and get that get out of that permit and not have to worry about that liability. That's ideal. But kind of knowing your permit timeframes, sort of like what we talked about earlier with the change in the review window from 14 to 30 days. Some states you can get a permit the same day or the next day. Some states have like a 14 to 30 or even 60-day review process. Kind of know those timeframes, because if you're trying to start the next day and you're submitting for your permit and you have to wait 60 days, and that'll kind of mess up your construction schedule. Make sure your consultant knows if the permits can be modified. Some states don't allow permits to be modified, so if you need to increase or decrease disturbed area, you have to get a whole other permit and terminate the existing permit. So that's kind of an important piece. So just kind of make sure if you're in a new state, make sure you kind of know that process and those requirements. Compliance during construction, I'm sure we're all a lot more familiar with that. I think routine inspections are basically the cornerstone of your compliance. Make sure you have a qualified person doing the inspections. It's good to find and document maintenance and action items on site, because those inspection reports form your narrative of compliance. If you have a 2-year project and you got 2 years of blank inspection reports and a regulator comes on site, that's going to be a red flag, and it's going to cause them to kind of dig deeper. So be careful with that. Post-storm event inspections, if you can avoid them, do. Some states, more and more states are kind of giving you an option to do maybe like a weekly inspection versus a 14-day and rain event inspection. So rain events can get a little hairy. So if you can just do an inspection the same day every week, that would be ideal. Documentation and SWPP upkeep are kind of one and the same. Most SWPPs require you to track BMP installation and removal on a map or a log or both, and track the modification of those plans or the amendments of those plans. They also require you to track land disturbance activities on a map or a log, and some states actually require those on an inspection form. So make sure you know those requirements. Are the contractors following the BMPs laid out in the SWPP? A lot of time that's structural, the structural BMPs, like your silt fence, or if you have berms or wattles or whatever. Are the contractors installing those per plan? And if they are those adequate? If not, then there's a process to modify or amend that may require consultation of your design engineer. So just make sure, if you are substituting BMPs, that the engineer says that they're acceptable substitutions. And remember, the SWPP is a living document. You know, if it's on your shelf during construction and it's never touched, that's not a good thing, because if the state or EPA show up, they're going to want to see your SWPP. It needs to be regularly updated to match site conditions and any changes in procedures or BMPs or anything like that. It's really one of the most common things I've seen in the EPA inspection, that the SWPPs aren't being kept up, or they're not consistent with site conditions. So just be careful with that, because documentation is kind of a big part of your compliance. So non-compliance, what does that mean? What constitutes non-compliance? It's a lot of things, really. Probably the biggest thing is starting work without a permit, or if you're under permitted. If you don't have a SWPP, or your SWPP's not being updated, like we just said, does the SWPP have to be on site? Some states allow you to have electronic versions of your SWPP, and some actually still require a paper version on site, which is, not the best thing. Paper versions of the SWPP tend to get thrown away, or somebody spills coffee on them and they're ruined. If you have a multi-year project and the SWPP's being regularly updated and it gets destroyed or misplaced, it's hard to kind of replace all that data. So be careful with your SWPPs if you do have to keep the paper versions on site. Not following the SWPP or the permit requirements is another big thing, and that usually kind of falls onto the pollution prevention piece or the good housekeeping pieces. So make sure, if you have specific BMPs in your SWPP for good housekeeping, make sure those are being followed, because those are kind of low-hanging fruit for regulators. If the project is out of sequence, not following the construction sequence, that's another big ticket item I've seen in regulatory inspections. Not following the erosion control plan and not amending the plan when it needs to be is also another big ticket item. If you're not following the erosion control plan in the first place, I mean, that's kind of like the minimum requirement, right? The erosion control plan is always going to change due to site condition changes or weather changes or whatever. You're probably going to have to add to your erosion control plan. So make sure that that's happening and that's being documented. BMP is not being installed per specification is also a big ticket item for regulators, really low-hanging fruit. Silt fence is a good example. I've worked in 26 states, and I've seen probably a dozen different specifications for silt fence. Florida, and the silt fence in Florida is going to be a lot different from the silt fence in Virginia. It's going to be a lot different from the silt fence in Nebraska. So make sure that those BMPs kind of meet the state or local requirements. Missing or late inspections is not the end of the world. For example, if your project's going to shut down for the holidays and there's not going to be anybody in site for more than a week, it's not a huge deal if you miss an inspection, as long as you can document it. So if you are going to shut down for the holidays, make sure you perform an inspection on the last day the project is open, and an inspection on the first day that it's open back up. And then just document that, no one was on site, it wasn't safe to perform an inspection. We did the best we could, because safety will always trump compliance. Documentation issues. I could spend a whole hour on this, but basically, make sure your SWPP's signed at the very least, and make sure somebody is keeping it updated. Documentation. That's one of the most important things with SWPP compliance. Make sure your templates are compliant with state requirements. I was on an EPA inspection for a client that we were using their proprietary inspection form, and the EPA called out that, I believe it was the current weather conditions weren't on the report. So that got dinged. So just make sure that all documents are compliant with the state requirements. And if you have a good consultant, then they should hopefully be able to help you out with that. Training logs are tricky. I've seen a lot of boilerplate SWP templates have training logs in them. There are states that require training and actually give you a very specific number of trainings that you have to achieve and the subjects of those trainings. So if there's a training log in your SWP, make sure you know if it's required or not. If it's not required, it's still a good idea to do, because then you can hold people accountable because they've been trained on compliance. And if they don't abide by that training, then that you have some leverage over them. Unauthorized discharges and spills are kind of the last big ticket item, low hanging fruit. Make sure any unauthorized discharges are being prevented if possible. And if not, they're being mitigated as soon as possible. I was on an EPA inspection and I was walking with the EPA guy, and there was a concrete truck washing out into a storm sewer system. That's not a good thing. That is an unauthorized discharge. Needless to say, that guy didn't work on the project again, but just keep that stuff in mind. Make sure you're policing your trades, making sure that they're not doing anything weird like that and causing non-compliance for your permit. So consequences of non-compliance are various. There's monetary fines with criminal, civil, or administrative nature. The EPA, if you're interested, the Clean Water Act Section 309 has kind of the layout of the enforcement for non-compliance with Clean Water Act. And it gets pretty pricey, but for the most part, you're probably looking at administrative fines if the EPA shows up on your site of like $10,000 per violation. But if it gets into the criminal, then that significantly increases, and then there's potential for jail time, which is relatively rare. But just keep that in mind. This is pretty serious stuff on a federal level. State fines are typically less than EPA, but they can also mirror the EPA. As saw in Virginia, I think in 2014, they rewrote their ordinance to basically mimic the EPA fine structure. So it was a little scary because those are pretty hefty fines, but make sure you kind of know what you're getting into on these things. I think stop work orders are probably the most detrimental because if the state issues you a stop work order, then you basically can't do any more work until any deficiencies that were noted were repaired. Kind of a step further than a stop work would be a consent order, which further delays work and potentially puts more stringent requirements for compliance on you, and more documentation and potentially reporting requirements to the state or EPA. So we want to avoid those, keep projects rolling on time and on schedule, under budget, hopefully. Revocation of permits is probably kind of like the top, where if you're doing something really bad and the state revokes your permit, they would most likely make you obtain an individual permit to start work again. And individual permits can get pretty strict in their requirements, so we definitely want to avoid those. Try to comply as best you can to the requirements of your SWP and your state permit, and stay out of trouble. So avoiding some pitfalls, communication, no matter what anybody says, communication is going to be your most important BMP on the project. If you have a really great maintenance crew, but nobody's communicating with them, then they're kind of moot, right? So make sure everyone involved and responsible with compliance in your project is in regular communication. I'd like meeting about the inspection. Maybe the inspection comes out on a Thursday, and then you have a quick meeting on Friday to make sure everyone's on the same page, knows what to do, can brainstorm some solutions to some relatively serious problems. update everyone on the progress of the project, so your inspector and your B&P maintenance provider kind of know what they need to focus on, and then talk about stabilization frequently. The worst thing I've seen is like especially on like large linear projects where everyone's focused on construction. They wrap up construction in October, November, and then they say, okay, now we got to go stabilize everything. Well, if you're in the Midwest, you're not getting anything stabilized until March. So you have to babysit the site over the winter, hopefully get it stabilized early to mid spring, and then hopefully everything goes right and you can close out in the summer. But if you stabilize as you go, especially on large disturbed areas, stabilize areas as soon as they're complete, it can really help on your construction schedule and your compliance. Make sure you have qualified personnel performing your inspections or performing your maintenance. Again, that qualified personnel is not, it has a very loose definition state to state, but just make sure they have the ability to identify on-site and potential problems. They are able to give recommendations on how to address issues, report to the design engineer when necessary, and know how to update the necessary SWPPP components. It might be a good idea to require a resume if they don't have a certification. I've seen that on a few projects where there's not necessarily a state certification, so they required the person to submit their resume before they would deem them qualified. Another big thing is standardize your documentation. I know we all probably use a lot of different consultants to do a lot of different things on our projects. If you have 4 or 5 different consultants creating your SWPPs, then you probably have 4 or 5 different templates, right? If you can create a standardized SWPPP template or at least an outline, so it's organized in a certain way, that'll be very, very beneficial and help avoid a very common pitfall of not being able to find stuff in the SWPPP or not using the SWPPP because it's full of jargon and people think it's not helpful. Some best practices that I highly recommend. A communication plan from the start is always a great idea. Meet frequently, have representatives from the permittee, from the contractors and maintenance crews there, kind of like your stormwater team. Create a stormwater team and have a communication plan that requires them to meet and talk about issues. Talk about stabilization every meeting. Designate on-site person of your team who's responsible for compliance. Hold them accountable and make sure that they can hold people accountable from the contractor to the maintenance provider to the inspector. Make sure they can hold everybody accountable. If there's no accountability on site, then there's no compliance on site. And develop a SWPPP template. I mean, it's not difficult. There's 3 or 4 basic components of a SWPPP. If you can integrate your standard operating procedures into the SWPPP, or typical construction sequences that you use, or typical housekeeping and pollution prevention BMPs that you actually use into the SWPPP, and then have your consultant or whoever develop the rest of it, that's ideal. The best BMPs are the ones that you're already doing well on site. If you can incorporate what you're already doing well on site into your SWPPP, then that's more than half the battle. If you have standardized documentation like SWPPs, it's easier to create standardized training for on-site personnel. Training is very crucial. It kind of goes hand in hand with safety. It's not as important as safety, but it is something that you could incorporate into safety training. You could do toolbox talks or tailgate talks, whatever you want to call them, monthly or something like that. But standardized trainings can greatly reduce potential non-compliance. You know, like we said before, in some states, these trainings are actually required. You have to do a certain number during the project, and you have to document it, but also use that documentation to create accountability for those people. If they've gone through a training on how to install a silt fence and they're still installing the silt fence wrong, they've signed the training, they were taught how to do it, and they're still not doing it right, hold them accountable. Quality checks, like I mentioned before, make sure there's multiple levels of quality checks on everything, on all your documentation, your SWPs, your permits, and remember, you know, some of these things you have to sign, or somebody from your company has to sign. So make sure what you're signing is correct. Regulatory relationships. This one's may seem weird, but I like having a relationship with regulators. I was on a 100-mile linear project for the first couple of years of my career, and it ran through 2 or 3 different states, and it was permitted in such a way that we had huge chunks of the project under one permit and another huge chunk under another permit. But we reached out to the state regulator or the state inspector for the project towards the end of the project while we were stabilizing areas, and we were able to develop a good relationship with him. Kind of took him on site, showed him areas that were complete and stabilized, and got him to sign off on those areas. So we were able to kind of close those out of the SWPP faster than a notice of termination. And by the time it came time to submit our NOT, you know, he was already on board. He knew us. He helped push that through a lot faster than it could have taken. So I highly recommend regulatory relationships, with a caveat of kind of test the waters first, because some regulators, at least in stormwater compliance, I like to call them dirt cops. So you can have dirt cops, which are not the best to work with, but they do have their function. But you kind of want that person who wants to be more of a partner in compliance, which I think is the majority of regulators. They want you to help them, and they want to help you. So if you can develop those relationships with regulators, it can greatly benefit you on your projects. So just kind of summarizing, communication plan is very, very important. Make sure you're communicating all your compliance needs. Make sure the right people are on that conversation, and make sure the people who are in on that conversation have accountability. Accountability with a project with no accountability has no compliance. So keep that in mind. If you can't keep your contractors or subcontractors accountable, or if you yourself don't have someone on site who's accountable, then it's kind of like the Wild West, right? You're just getting inspection reports, reading them hopefully, and handing them off, but there's no follow-up. So you want to make sure you have some sort of accountability plan for compliance. Standardized documents, I can't stress this enough, are very, very, very important. Standardized documents lead to standardized training, which helps immensely in compliance. Quality check everything before signing it. You never sign a loan documents without reading them. So make sure you're reading those compliance documents before you're signing them as well. Qualified personnel. If you're having the contractor perform the inspections, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I've seen it go horribly, horribly wrong, but I've also seen it work out pretty well. If the contractor is performing the inspections and they're just putting someone they just hired off the street on the inspections, that's a bad sign. You want to make sure the person is qualified to do the inspections. If you're using a consultant, that's great. Just make sure that person is qualified. Don't be afraid to ask for a resume or certifications or whatever. And then the last thing, just recapping, regulatory relationships. They can be so beneficial to the project. So keep that in mind. And again, kind of avoid those dirt cops, look for those partners in compliance. And with that, are there any questions?
So it looks like Robert Foster has the question, do any jurisdictions have stormwater regulations regarding smaller scale residential solar installations? For example, a ground mount 5 to 10 kilowatt power PV system, which might utilize a concrete foundation and pad?
I'm not sure, but I can look into that. Most localities have regulations for residential, but as far as smaller solar installations, I'm not sure. Is there, if you want to shoot me an email, I can look at that to you if you're looking for a specific area or locality.
Josh, can you share with the attendees your email and I can put it in the chat?
There we go.
Oh, there it is.
It's hard to speak generally on locality requirements because they vary so widely. So if you narrow it down for me, it would be much more helpful.
Perfect. Does anybody have any additional questions? You can throw them in the question and answer chat function. Alrighty, well, I think you answered everybody's questions through the presentation. And so if anything additional does come up, feel free to email Josh at jhansen@olsson.com. And thank you so much for joining the October webinar. And remember to join and support ASES and learn more at ases.org. And also submit your calls for participation for our 2022 conference and learn more about our conference at ases.org/conference. Thank you all for joining. Bye.
Thank you.